Hello, I'm Shamsa AlSalloum, a PhD student in Economics and Public Finance at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Today, I'll be presenting a joint work with my professor and supervisor, Dr. Miguel Grijalba, for the CIMA Congress 2021, which is about comparative analysis of the VAT revenue performance of the UAE, KSA, and the EU VAT system. To assess the revenue performance of the UAE VAT system, I have selected the following benchmarks. First, the VAT productivity ratio. Second, the C efficiency ratio. Third, the VAT gap ratio. Now, to begin with the VAT productivity ratio, a brief explanation of the VAT productivity ratio is it is referred to as the efficiency ratio and has been widely used as a performance indicator of a VAT system. It is defined as the ratio of VAT revenue to GDP divided by the standard VAT rate. And the higher the ratio, the better VAT performance is, and the low ratio signifies loss of VAT revenue. Now, moving to the C efficiency ratio, it is defined as the ratio of VAT revenue as a share of consumption rather than GDP to the standard VAT rate. Since VAT is a tax on final consumption and not on GDP, the C efficiency ratio is a more reliable indicator of the VAT system revenue performance as compared to VAT productivity ratio. The VAT system, which imposes a uniform tax on all consumption, will have a C efficiency ratio of 100%. So a higher or lower ratio of 100% will indicate a deviation from a single VAT rate on consumption. The third benchmark, which is the VAT gap ratio, is defined as the difference between VAT collected and that which is potentially collectible if final consumption were taxed at the standard VAT rate. So the VAT gap provides an explanation concerning the extent of VAT evasion, as VAT evasion is actually collected from the VAT gap. And the lower the VAT gap ratio, the better performance a VAT system is. Now, moving to assessing the UAE VAT performance, as the VAT has been implemented in the UAE in January 1st, 2018, 2 years of data relating to nominal GDP, final consumption, and VAT revenue are being used to calculate benchmarks for assessing UAE VAT system revenue performance. So I have taken all the data for the VAT revenue and the total consumption and calculating the VAT revenue benchmarks using all the various data to assess the UAE data system. So analyzing the UAE results, we can see that the VAT productivity ratio of the UAE VAT system in 2018 was 0.35%, whereas in 2018 it increased to 0.38%. The higher the ratio, and this increase indicates a more productive the VAT system is in 2019 compared to 2018. Moving to the C efficiency ratio, we can see there is an increase also in 2%, where it was 0.70% in 2018 and increased to 0.72% in 2019. This increase shows that if the VAT revenue have collected while only applying only the standard VAT rate to all final consumption, the UAE will be collecting 0.72% of VAT revenue in 2019. Last but not least, the VAT gap ratio in 2018 was 30% and was reduced to 28% in 2019. The VAT gap shows that if the UAE has not allowed any exemption and has applied a uniform VAT rate at 5% on all consumption without any revenue leakage, 30 and 28% more revenue it would be collected in 2018 and 2019 respectively. Therefore, the UAE could bridge the existing VAT gap through better VAT policy and enforcement measures to block VAT evasion. Moving to a comparative analysis with Saudi Arabia. Well, to begin with, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE are GCC member states and have many socio-economic similarities. In addition, both countries have implemented VAT on the same date, which is January 1st, 2018, at the same VAT standard rate, which is 5%. So for comparison purposes with those computed for VAT of the UAE, year 2018 and year 2019 are selected for a comparative analysis, as Saudi Arabia increased VAT rate from 5 to 15% in 2020. So now, using the similar benchmarks and applying them to Saudi Arabia ratios and comparing them to the UAE ratios, we can find the following. The VAT productivity ratio, we can see a 0.35 percentage point in 2018 and 0.38 percentage point in 2019, the UAE, compared to 0.31 percentage point in both years 2018 and 2019 in Saudi Arabia. This signifies that the VAT in UAE is more productive in terms of revenue yielder as a percentage of GDP as compared to the VAT system in Saudi Arabia. Secondly, for the C efficiency ratio, we can see that Saudi Arabia is able to collect 49% and 50% of VAT revenue it could have collected if it applied only the standard VAT rate on all final consumption expenditure for the years 2018 and 2019. On the other hand, UAE was able to collect 70 and 72% of VAT revenue if it could have collected while applying only the standard VAT rate on all final consumption expenditure for the year 2018 and 2019 respectively. Hence, the results indicate that the VAT system of the UAE is more efficient in taxing final consumption compared to VAT system in KSA. Last but not least, the VAT gap ratio is 51% and 50% in the year 2018 and 2019 Saudi Arabia, indicates a low level of compliance and higher rate of VAT evasion compared to the level of UAE, which is high as evident from the low and reducing VAT gap of 30 and 28% in the year 2018 and 2019 respectively. So in general, overall, we can conclude that the higher VAT productivity and C efficiency ratio and lower VAT gap ratio in the UAE signifies that its VAT system is performing better in terms of VAT revenue yielder than Saudi Arabia. Better revenue performance of the UAE VAT system could be due to better legislation, better VAT policy, and stricter enforcement of the law, aiming to control VAT evasion and fraud. Now, moving to a comparative analysis with the European Union. First, the VAT productivity ratio in 2019. The EU average VAT productivity ratio was 7.39% versus 1.89% in UAE, which indicates a higher VAT performance yielder for the EU in comparison to the UAE. For the C efficiency ratio in 2018, the EU average C efficiency ratio was 0.56% versus 0.70% in UAE, which shows that the UAE has a better VAT revenue yielder than the EU system. For the VAT gap ratio in 2018, the EU VAT gap ratio was 11% versus 30% in UAE, and in 2019 the EU VAT gap ratio was 9.6% versus 28% in UAE. We can see that the UAE has a huge VAT gap ratio in comparison to the EU. This indicates a higher VAT evasion in comparison to the EU and lower enforcement of the law in comparison to the EU, but maybe that can be explained due to the VAT system is very new in comparison to the EU, which is years and history of that system. So now for the factors contributing to revenue performance in the UAE. First of all, it's a better VAT design. So no multiple rate. A number of research studies have concluded that VAT generates higher revenue in countries with a single rate than in countries with multiple VAT rates. And the UAE has no multiple rates. It has a very standard VAT rate. Secondly, appropriate VAT registration threshold. A number of studies also supported the higher and uniform registration threshold because keeping the registration threshold low will actually restrict already overburdened administration cost with a large amount of essentially useless work without substantial revenues. Fewer deviation for standard VAT rate in which it yields more tax revenue without compromising neutrality. Large size of formal economy in which VAT can be problematic when the economy has a large informal sector. Informal economy affects public expenditures and revenues and causes a distortion in the market and the economy as a whole. As a matter of fact, when there is no strong relationship between the state and its citizen, then the citizens will seek alternative ways to operate informally, such as democracy. However, in the case of the UAE, there is a very strong relationship between the state and its citizens, in which citizens tend to perform formally and operate by the rules. In addition to that, improved enforcement capacity. The rules of law is well maintained in the UAE, and it is one of the least corrupt countries in the region. Moreover, its economic development is associated with a higher level of education, literacy, and technology, and such variables raises the capacity to administer taxes. In addition, as studies have proved that legislation and tax administration is important because it generates the redistribution of the fiscal system. It is necessary to better handle tax evasion and manage public resources. Now, reaching to the end, what could be done to improve revenue performance of the UAE VAT system? First of all is policy and enforcement. VAT policy and enforcement mechanism for minimizing policy gap and enforcement gap is crucial. In addition, the tax administration should make use of technology and computerized software following the footsteps of other economies operating VAT systems, such as the EU. Tax authorities actually must be well trained and fully equipped with logistics in analyzing the data pertaining to potential taxable person to broaden the VAT base. In addition to that, automated systems should be employed for an efficient and speedy processing of VAT revenues of companies and businesses. So tax authorities must carry out investigation on a monthly basis to identify non-filers and taxable persons who made late payments to ensure that VAT dues are enforced and collected on time. Also, investing in human resources is very essential. Improving auditing skills. Audit is a tool that strategically monitors the VAT regime. It's proposed that the UAE Tax Authority will have to be well trained and fully equipped with technology to conduct an efficient audit to ensure that every liability is paid and every tax due is collected and given to the government within the deadline. For VAT refunds also, improving post-refund audit and verifications are important for preventing issuance of fake refunds and protecting government revenues. Low public awareness is also a problem in the UAE, in which efficient and effective VAT implementation may not be possible when there is low public awareness and taxable persons are ignorant about VAT rules and regulation. Now, since VAT in the UAE is at the developing stage, lack of awareness in the society about VAT rules and regulation is adversely affecting the smooth and neutral functioning of the VAT system. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.